My grandfather passed away 3 months ago at the age of 92. He'd lived his entire life on the same 40 acres of land his grandfather had homesteaded back in 1890. I'd spent every summer there as a kid, riding horses down the long gravel road that connected the property to the state highway, fishing in the creek, and listening to Grandpa's stories about the old days. When the lawyer called me in for the reading of the will, I honestly didn't expect much. Maybe some family photos, his old truck, perhaps a little cash. What I got instead was the entire ranch. Hey friends, welcome back to HOA Backdoor Stories. Good to see you here again. Let me know. Where are you watching from today? Sit back, relax, and let's take a closer look behind the closed doors of another unbelievable HOA drama, all 40 acres, the house, the barn, everything. The lawyer handed me a thick folder of documents, deeds, surveys, and historical records going back over a century. Your grandfather wanted you to have this, he said. He always said you were the only one who truly appreciated the land. I was speechless. I'd been living in a cramped apartment in the city, working a regular job, barely making ends meet. Now I owned 40 acres of prime rural property with a beautiful 3-bedroom ranch house, a restored barn, and that long, peaceful road I'd loved so much as a child. The road was actually one of my favorite features. It ran for almost exactly 1 mile from the state highway to the main house, lined with old oak trees my great-great-grandfather had planted in the early 1900s. It was gravel, well-maintained, and absolutely beautiful, especially in the fall when the leaves changed colors. Within 2 weeks, I'd quit my job, packed up my life, and moved to the ranch permanently. It felt like coming home. The house needed some work, but it had good bones. The property was paid off, taxes were reasonable, and I had enough savings to get by while I figured out what to do next. Maybe start a small farm, maybe just enjoy the peace and quiet. For the first month, everything was perfect. I spent my days fixing up the house, walking the property, and getting reacquainted with the land I'd loved as a child. The road was in decent shape, just needed some grading and fresh gravel in a few spots. I noticed some tire tracks I didn't recognize, but figured it was probably the mail carrier or maybe a lost tourist who'd used it to turn around. Then one morning, I woke up to the sound of traffic. Not city traffic, but definitely more vehicles than should be on a private road in the middle of nowhere. I walked down to the entrance and counted 11 cars passing by in just 15 minutes. They were all heading toward a new development I'd noticed being built about 2 miles down the state highway. The development hadn't been there when I was a kid. According to my neighbor, an old farmer named Dutch who'd known my grandfather for decades, it had gone up about 5 years ago. Meadowbrook Estates, Dutch told me, shaking his head. Fancy HOA community. Couple hundred houses, all those city folks wanting to live in the country without actually living in the country, if you know what I mean. They've been using your grandfather's road as a shortcut for the past 3 years. I was confused. Shortcut to where? Dutch pulled out a county map and showed me. The official entrance to Meadowbrook Estates was off the state highway about 3 miles south of my property, but if you used my road, you could cut through and access their neighborhood from the backside, saving about 7 miles and avoiding a traffic light that apparently backed up during rush hour. Your grandfather tried to stop them, Dutch continued, put up signs, even parked his truck across the road a few times, but he was old, and they just ignored him, started claiming it was a public easement, that they had a right to use it. Broke his heart, honestly. He spent the last year of his life watching strangers tear up the road his family built. That made my blood boil. This was my family's land, my family's road. Nobody had the right to just use it without permission. I drove down to the entrance, and sure enough, there were fresh tire tracks everywhere, ruts forming in the gravel, and trash littering the sides, fast food bags, coffee cups, even a few beer cans. Over the next week, I counted the traffic. On average, 50 to 60 cars per day were using my road. 50 to 60 cars, tearing up the gravel, creating dust clouds, treating my private property like it was their personal highway. I started by being reasonable. I put up a nice sign at the entrance that read, "Private road, no trespassing, property owners only." I even included my phone number in case someone had a legitimate reason to be there. The sign lasted exactly 2 days before someone knocked it down. I put up another one. Same result. I tried standing at the entrance one morning during rush hour, flagging people down to politely explain this was private property. Most just drove around me. A few rolled down their windows to yell that I couldn't block a public road. One guy even threatened to call the police on me for harassment. Fine. If they wanted to play it that way, I'd go through official channels. I looked up the Meadowbrook Estates HOA contact information and called their office. A woman named Patricia answered, and she had that particular tone of voice that immediately told me this was going to be painful. Meadowbrook Estates HOA, how may I direct your call? She said in a voice that could freeze water. I explained the situation calmly and professionally. I'd inherited the property, the road was private, and I needed their residents to stop using it. There was a long pause, then Patricia said something that made my jaw drop. I'm sorry, but you're mistaken, Patricia said with absolute confidence. That road has been a community access point for years. It's a historical easement. You can't just close it because you inherited the property. I took a deep breath, trying to stay calm. Ma'am, with all due respect, there is no easement. This is private property that's been in my family since 1890. You're welcome to check the county records. She laughed, actually laughed. Sir, I don't need to check anything. Our residents have been using that road for years without issue. That establishes a prescriptive easement under state law. You should really consult with an attorney before making threats. Then she hung up on me. I sat there staring at my phone in disbelief. Prescriptive easement? I'd heard the term before, but didn't know exactly what it meant. I spent the next hour researching online. Apparently, in some states, if people use your property openly and continuously for a certain number of years without your permission, they can actually gain legal rights to keep using it. The requirements varied by state, but generally it needed to be something like 10 to 20 years of continuous use. My stomach dropped. If people had been using this road for years while my grandfather was still alive and he hadn't taken legal action to stop them, could they actually claim some kind of right to it? I called a local attorney the next morning, a guy named Richard Thornton who'd handled some work for my grandfather years ago. I explained the situation, and I could hear him sigh over the phone. Your grandfather mentioned this problem to me about 2 years before he passed, Richard said. He was worried about exactly what you're describing. The good news is that prescriptive easements are very difficult to establish. The bad news is that HOAs can be incredibly aggressive when they think they have a right to something. He agreed to send a formal cease and desist letter to the HOA on my behalf, which he did that afternoon. It was a clear, professional letter explaining that the road was private property, no easement existed, and continued use would be considered trespassing. I thought that would be the end of it. I was wrong. 2 days later, I received a certified letter from a law firm representing Meadowbrook Estates HOA. It was 8 pages long and filled with legal jargon, but the basic message was clear. They claimed a prescriptive easement had been established through years of continuous use. They had no intention of stopping, and if I attempted to block the road, they would seek a court injunction against me and sue for damages. They also demanded that I maintain the road to their standards, including grading, graveling, and snow removal in winter, arguing that since it served as community access, I had a responsibility to keep it in good condition. I called Richard immediately. They're bluffing, he said, though he didn't sound entirely confident. But we need to be prepared. Do you have any documentation of your grandfather trying to stop them? Signs he put up, letters he sent, anything? I searched through the files my grandfather had left and found a few things. Some photos of no trespassing signs, a couple of angry letters he'd written to the HOA that were never responded to, and a journal entry from about 4 years ago where he'd written about confronting some drivers. It wasn't much, but it showed he'd objected to their use of the road. Meanwhile, the traffic continued. In fact, it seemed to get worse, like the HOA residents were making a point of using the road even more now that there was a dispute. I started documenting everything, taking photos of the traffic, the damage to the road, the trash left behind. I set up a trail camera at the entrance to count vehicles. Over a 1 Week period, I documented 387 vehicles using my road without permission. That's when things escalated. I came home one afternoon to find a group of about 15 people standing at my gate, holding signs that said things like "Public Access for All" and "Stop Road Bullying." They were led by a woman in her mid-50s with perfectly styled blonde hair and designer sunglasses, wearing what looked like a $500 outfit completely inappropriate for standing on a gravel road. She introduced herself as Karen Whitmore, president of the Meadowbrook Estates HOA. "We're here to inform you that we will not be intimidated," she announced loudly, like she was addressing a crowd of hundreds instead of her small group of followers. "This road has served our community for years, and we have every legal right to use it. If you attempt to block access, we will take immediate legal action." I tried to respond calmly, explaining again that this was private property, but she just talked over me, getting louder and more aggressive. Her group started chanting something about community rights. It was absolutely surreal. A sheriff's deputy eventually showed up, responding to a call from my neighbor Dutch, who'd seen the commotion. The deputy, a young guy named Morrison, looked completely overwhelmed by the situation. Karen immediately started talking to him like he was there to support her cause, demanding he inform me that I couldn't block a public road. Deputy Morrison looked at me helplessly. "Sir, is this your property?" I confirmed it was. He turned to Karen. "Ma'am, if it's private property, he has the right to control access." Karen's face turned red. "This is a historical easement. We have legal documentation." She did not, in fact, have any documentation with her. Deputy Morrison suggested everyone leave and handle this through proper legal channels. Karen and her group finally left, but not before she pointed at me and said, "You haven't heard the last of this. We have resources, and we will win." That night I sat on my grandfather's porch looking down that beautiful tree-lined road and made a decision. If they wanted a legal battle, I'd give them one. But first, I needed to know exactly what I was dealing with. The next morning, I drove to the county recorder's office to pull every document related to my property. The county recorder's office was in the basement of the courthouse, a cramped room filled with filing cabinets and the musty smell of old paper. The clerk, an elderly woman named Martha, who'd apparently worked there for 30 years, greeted me with a warm smile. "What can I help you find, hon?" she asked. I explained I needed every document related to my property, going back as far as records existed. Martha's eyes lit up. "Oh, you got one of the old homestead properties? Those are always interesting. Give me your parcel number." I handed her the information, and she disappeared into the back. When she returned 20 minutes later, she was carrying a large box and had a huge smile on her face. "You're in luck," she said. "Your property is one of the oldest continuously owned parcels in the county. We've got records going back to the original land patent from 1890. This is going to take you a while to go through." She set me up at a table with the box and showed me how their filing system worked. Then she added something that caught my attention. "You know, we had some folks in here about 3 years ago asking about easements on this property. HOA people, I think. I told them the same thing I'm telling you. All the records are public, but there's nothing in our system showing any easements on your land. They seemed pretty disappointed. That was interesting. So the HOA had already tried to find documentation of an easement and come up empty." I started going through the documents chronologically. The oldest was the original land patent, signed by President Benjamin Harrison in 1890, granting 160 acres to my great-great-grandfather James Crawford under the Homestead Act. The document was beautiful with ornate calligraphy and an official seal. It clearly stated the land was being granted to James Crawford and his heirs, with no restrictions or easements mentioned. I took photos of every page with my phone. Next came the survey from 1891, showing the exact boundaries of the property. Then a deed from 1923, where James Crawford transferred the property to his son, my great-grandfather, Robert Crawford. There was a note in the margin that caught my eye. Property includes private road constructed 1921. 1922 by owner, connecting property to state highway. So the road had been built by my family, on my family's land, with my family's money. I found the actual construction records dated 1921, showing my great-grandfather had hired a local contractor to grade and gravel a road from the highway to the house. The invoice was for $350, which would have been a significant amount of money back then. I continued through the decades of documents: transfer from Robert to his son Michael in 1956, transfer from Michael to my grandfather Thomas in 1982. Every single document clearly showed the property and road as privately owned, with no easements, no public access rights, no restrictions on the owner's ability to control access. Then I found something crucial. In the filing cabinet for the 1990s, there was a thick folder of correspondence between the county and a development company that wanted to build what would eventually become Meadowbrook Estates. The developer had initially proposed using my grandfather's road as a secondary access point to their development. There was a letter from the developer to my grandfather offering to pay him $50,000 for a permanent easement across his property. And there was my grandfather's response, written in his distinctive handwriting: "Absolutely not. This road is private and will remain private. Do not contact me again about this matter." The date was 1998. The developer had tried twice more, increasing the offer to $75,000, then $100,000. My grandfather refused each time. Finally, there was a letter from the County Planning Commission to the developer, dated 2001, stating that since the property owner refused to grant an easement, the development would need to use alternative access roads. The development was approved with its current entrance on the state highway. This was exactly what I needed. Not only was there no easement, but there was clear documentation that one had been specifically requested and explicitly refused. The county knew it, the developer knew it, and anyone who bothered to check the records would know it, but I wanted to be absolutely certain. I asked Martha if there was any way an easement could exist without being recorded. "Technically, yes," she said. "A prescriptive easement doesn't get recorded until it's established through a court order, but even then there'd be a court case in the records. Let me check something." She went to her computer and searched the county court records. "Nope," she said after a few minutes. "No court cases involving your property and any easements. If someone wants to claim a prescriptive easement, they'd need to file a lawsuit and prove their case. Hasn't happened." I thanked Martha profusely and asked for official copies of everything. She printed out certified copies of the key documents, each one stamped with the county seal. The cost was $80, and it was the best money I'd ever spent. But I wasn't done yet. If I was going to shut this down permanently, I needed to be absolutely certain about every aspect of the property. I called a surveyor named Jim Patterson, who'd been recommended by Richard Thornton. Jim agreed to come out the next day to do a complete survey of the property, including the road. When Jim arrived, he brought equipment that looked like something from a science fiction movie: GPS units, laser measurers, all kinds of high-tech gear. He spent 6 hours walking every inch of the property, taking measurements, checking against historical surveys, and marking boundaries. When he finished, he sat down with me on the porch and showed me his findings. "Your property line is exactly where the old surveys show it," he said, pointing to a map. "The road is 100% on your land, from the state highway entrance all the way to your house. It doesn't cross any other properties. There are no shared boundaries with the HOA development, and there are no utility easements or other encumbrances. It's as clean as property gets," he continued. "I also checked the HOA development boundaries. They're about a quarter-mile from your property at the closest point. The only way they can access your road is by crossing your land, which means they're trespassing every single time they use it." I asked him to document everything in a formal report, which he said would take about a week. As he packed up his equipment, he added one more thing. "You know, I surveyed that HOA development when it was being built. The developer cut corners on their entrance road to save money. That's why their access is so inconvenient and why they probably started using yours. But that's not your problem. This is clearly private property." That evening, I organized all my documentation into a comprehensive file. I had the original 1890 land patent, the 1921 road construction records, every deed transfer, my grandfather's refusal to grant an easement, the County Planning Commission records, and soon I'd have a current professional survey. It was an airtight case. The road was mine, had always been mine, and was always going to be mine. Now I just needed to decide what to do about it. Armed with my documentation, I scheduled a meeting with Richard Thornton to discuss next steps. He reviewed everything I'd found and actually laughed with relief. "This is even better than I hoped," he said. "They don't have a leg to stand on. Not only is there no easement, but there's explicit documentation that one was refused. And the prescriptive easement argument falls apart because your grandfather actively objected to their use of the road, which defeats the open and notorious requirement." He drafted a comprehensive legal letter to the HOA, attaching certified copies of all the key documents. The letter made several points very clear. The road was private property, no easement existed or had ever existed, continued use constituted trespassing, and if they didn't cease immediately, I would pursue legal action, including claims for damages to the road and injunctive relief. We sent it via certified mail and email. The response came 3 days later, and it was not what I expected. Instead of backing down, Karen Whitmore doubled down. Her response letter was even longer than the first one, citing obscure case law and making increasingly absurd arguments. She claimed that because the road connected to a state highway, it was subject to public access laws. She argued that my grandfather's objections didn't count because he hadn't taken legal action. She even suggested that by inheriting the property, I had somehow inherited an obligation to maintain public access. It was complete nonsense, but it told me something important. They weren't going to stop voluntarily. They were going to force me to take action. Richard agreed. "Some HOAs are like this," he explained. "They get so convinced they're right that they'd rather spend $50,000 fighting a losing battle than admit they're wrong. We need to file for an injunction." Before we went to court, I decided to try one more thing. I drove to the Meadowbrook Estates HOA office and asked for a meeting with Karen Whitmore. To my surprise, she agreed to see me immediately. Her office was exactly what I expected. Expensive furniture, photos of her shaking hands with local politicians, awards from various HOA organizations. She sat behind her desk like a queen on a throne and didn't offer me a seat. "I assume you're here to discuss terms of access," she said coldly. I laid out all my documentation on her desk: the land patent, the deeds, the survey results, my grandfather's refusals, the planning commission records, everything. I walked her through each document, explaining clearly and calmly that no easement existed and that her residents were trespassing on private property. She barely glanced at the documents. "You can show me all the papers you want," she said. "The reality is that our residents have been using this road for years. Taking it away now would cause significant hardship to our community. It would add time to everyone's commute, increase traffic on already congested roads, and decrease our property values. A judge will take that into consideration." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. "So your argument is that because you've been trespassing for a long time, you should be allowed to keep trespassing?" She smiled coldly. "Our attorney says we have a strong case. Are you really prepared to spend tens of thousands of dollars fighting this in court? Because we have an assessment fund of over $300,000 specifically for legal issues. We can outlast you." That's when I realized this wasn't really about the law or property rights. It was about power and control. Karen was used to getting her way, used to forcing residents to comply with her rules, and she genuinely believed that her position as HOA president gave her authority over everyone, including people who didn't even live in her community. I gathered up my documents. "You're right about one thing," I said. "This is probably going to court. But you should know that I'm not some helpless homeowner you can bully into compliance. I have clear documentation, I have the law on my side, and I'm not backing down." Her smile disappeared. "Get out of my office." As I left, I passed several HOA residents in the parking lot. A few of them recognized me and started to complain about how unfair I was being. One man told me I was being selfish. A woman said I was probably doing this because I hated progress and development. Nobody wanted to hear that it was my property and I had every right to control it. That night, I made my decision. If they wanted a fight, I'd give them one. But I wasn't going to wait for them to take me to court. I was going to take control of my property immediately and let them be the ones who had to file a lawsuit if they wanted to keep using my road. The next morning, I called a security company that specialized in rural property protection. The owner, a former Marine named Jack Torres, came out that same afternoon to assess the situation. I showed him the entrance to my property and explained what I needed, a gate system that would completely block vehicle access, but would be legal, safe, and professional. Jack walked the entrance area, taking measurements and notes. "You want something substantial," he said. "Not just a chain across the road, but a real gate that sends a message. I'd recommend a commercial-grade steel gate, 12 feet wide, with automatic opener, security cameras, and proper signage. We can have it installed in 3 days." The quote was $15,000. It was a lot of money, but I'd inherited enough from my grandfather to cover it, and this was an investment in protecting my property. I told Jack to proceed. Over the next 3 days, Jack's crew worked from dawn to dusk. They poured concrete footings for the gate posts, installed heavy-duty steel posts that were sunk 4 feet into the ground, and mounted a massive steel gate that looked like it could stop a tank. The gate was painted black with gold lettering that read, "Private property, no trespassing. Violators will be prosecuted." They installed an automatic opener system that I could control from my phone, along with an intercom for legitimate visitors. On either side of the gate, they mounted high-definition security cameras with night vision and license plate readers. The cameras fed to a system in my house where I could monitor everything and save footage to the cloud. Jack also installed motion-activated lights and secondary cameras, covering the approaches to the gate. Finally, they put up professional signs on both sides. "Private road. No public access. Owner access only." The signs included citations to the relevant state trespassing laws and warned that violators would be prosecuted. When they finished, the installation looked incredibly professional and permanent. There was no ambiguity about what this gate meant. This was private property, and you couldn't pass without authorization. I scheduled the activation for early Monday morning during rush hour when HOA traffic would be at its peak. I wanted them to see it when they tried to use my road for their commute. I also sent one final letter to Karen Whitmore and the HOA board, informing them that as of Monday morning the road would be secured and no unauthorized access would be permitted. I didn't wait for a response. Monday morning I woke up at 5:30 and drove down to the gate. Jack had arrived early to make sure everything was working properly. We tested the automatic opener, checked all the cameras, and verified the intercom system. Everything worked perfectly. At 6:15, the first vehicle approached, a black BMW sedan. I recognized the driver from the protest at my property. He slowed down, saw the gate, and stopped. Through the camera system, I watched his face go from confusion to anger. He got out of his car and walked up to the gate, pulling on it like he could somehow force it open. The intercom activated automatically. "This is private property," the recorded message said. "Authorized access only. Please turn around and use public roads." The driver started yelling at the camera. I couldn't make out everything he said, but I caught phrases like "you can't do this" and "we have rights" and several creative curse words. After about 2 minutes of yelling, he got back in his car and left. Over the next hour, 23 vehicles approached my gate. Some turned around immediately when they saw it. Others stopped to read the signs or tried calling someone, presumably Karen or other HOA board members. 3 people got out and tried to physically move the gate or find a way around it. All of them were caught on camera. By 7:30, the approaches on both sides of the gate had small traffic jams as confused HOA residents tried to figure out what was happening. I could see people on their phones obviously calling each other, trying to organize a response. At 8 o'clock, Karen Whitmore herself arrived, driving a white Mercedes SUV. She pulled up to the gate, got out, and marched straight to the intercom. "Open this gate immediately," she demanded. "This is illegal, and you will be sued for everything you own." The intercom recording played again, explaining this was private property. She started pressing the call button repeatedly, apparently thinking she could summon me to argue with her. I was watching from my house and had no intention of engaging with her. After 5 minutes of futile button pressing and yelling at the camera, she got back in her Mercedes and sped off. I later learned she went directly to the county sheriff's office to file a complaint. Deputy Morrison was assigned to respond and drove out to my property around 10 that morning. I met him at the gate and showed him all my documentation. He reviewed everything carefully, including the land patent, the surveys, the records showing no easement existed, and my grandfather's written refusals. "This all looks in order," he finally said. "It's your property. You have the right to control access. The HOA is claiming you're blocking a public road, but I don't see any evidence of that." He took photos of all the documents for his report. "HOA president said she's going to have the county attorney look into it, but between you and me, I think you're in the clear. This is a civil property dispute at worst, not a criminal matter." After he left, I spent the rest of the day monitoring the cameras. The traffic patterns had completely changed. Instead of steady flow of vehicles using my road, there was nothing. The HOA residents had been forced to use the official entrance to their development and the public roads they'd been avoiding. That evening, I got a phone call from Richard Thornton. "Well, you've certainly stirred things up," he said with amusement in his voice. "The HOA filed an emergency motion for a temporary restraining order to force you to open the gate. The hearing is scheduled for Friday. They're claiming irreparable harm to their community." I asked if we had a good chance of winning. "Better than good," he said. "They have to prove they have a legal right to use your road. They can't. The worst-case scenario is the judge orders the gate to stay closed but tells both sides to work it out. Best case, he dismisses their motion entirely and awards you attorney fees." The hearing couldn't come soon enough. I was ready to end this once and for all. The courthouse was packed on Friday morning. Karen had apparently mobilized the entire HOA community, with at least 50 residents filling the gallery. Many were holding signs about community rights and access for all. I sat at the plaintiff's table with Richard while the HOA's attorney, a slick-looking guy named Bradford Chen, sat across from us with Karen beside him. Judge Patricia Martinez presided. She was in her 60s with a reputation for being no-nonsense and not tolerating waste of the court's time. Bradford started with an impassioned speech about how closing the road caused severe hardship to the Meadowbrook Estates community. He claimed residents now had to drive an extra 12 minutes each way for their commutes, that emergency vehicle response times were affected, and that property values in the development were dropping. He showed photos of the gate and argued it was an unreasonable obstruction of what had become a community thoroughfare. Then he made his legal argument that a prescriptive easement had been established through years of open and continuous use. He cited several cases from other states and claimed that my grandfather's failure to take legal action meant he had acquiesced to public use of the road. Judge Martinez listened patiently, then turned to Richard. "Counsel, your response?" Richard stood and methodically destroyed every argument. He presented the original 1890 land patent showing clear private ownership, the 1921 construction records proving my family built the road with private funds, and every deed transfer showing continuous private ownership with no easements. He then presented the letters from 1998 through 2001, where my grandfather explicitly refused to grant an easement when the development was being built, which showed active opposition to public use, completely defeating the prescriptive easement argument. He presented the survey from Jim Patterson confirming the road was entirely on my property, the County Planning Commission records acknowledging no easement existed, and the letter from Martha at the recorder's office confirming no easement was recorded. Finally, he presented documentation of the damage to my road from unauthorized use, photos showing ruts, erosion, and deterioration, along with a contractor's estimate that repairs would cost $12,000. He argued that I had suffered actual financial harm from the HOA's trespassing and was entitled not just to close the road, but to compensation for damages. Judge Martinez studied the documents carefully, then looked at Bradford. "Counselor, do you have any evidence of an easement, any recorded document, any court order, anything beyond the claim that your clients have been using this road?" Bradford shuffled through his papers. "Your Honor, we have affidavits from multiple residents stating they've used the road regularly for years, which establishes the open and continuous use required for prescriptive easement." "But the property owner objected in writing," Judge Martinez said, holding up my grandfather's letters. "Multiple times going back more than 20 years. He explicitly refused to grant an easement. How does your client overcome that? Bradford tried to argue that objections weren't enough, that my grandfather should have physically blocked the road or taken legal action. Judge Martinez cut him off. So your position is that a property owner must spend money on gates or lawsuits to protect their clearly established rights, or else they lose those rights? That's not how property law works, counselor. She turned to Karen. Ma'am, when your development was being built, were you aware that the property owner had refused to grant an easement for this road? Karen hesitated. I joined the board after construction was completed, Your Honor, but our understanding has always been that the road was available for community use. Based on what? Did anyone from your HOA ever contact the property owner to request permission or negotiate an easement? Karen's face flushed. We didn't think we needed permission. The road had always been open. Judge Martinez shook her head. That's the problem right there. You assumed you had a right to use someone else's private property without ever confirming that right existed or seeking permission. That's not an easement. That's trespassing. She looked at the crowd of HOA residents in the gallery. I understand you're all frustrated. You've been using this road for years and now suddenly you can't. But the law is clear. Private property is private property. The fact that you've been trespassing for a long time doesn't give you the right to continue trespassing. She ruled from the bench. The motion for temporary restraining order was denied. I had every right to gate my private road. The HOA had no legal claim to access, and if they continued to trespass or harass me, I could seek further legal remedies, including damages. The courtroom erupted. HOA residents were shouting about injustice and demanding the judge reconsider. Judge Martinez gavelled for order and warned that anyone who didn't settle down would be held in contempt. As we left the courthouse, several HOA residents confronted us in the parking lot. One man got in my face saying I was destroying their community and he'd make sure I regretted it. Richard stepped between us and suggested the man leave before he got arrested for assault. Over the next week, the HOA tried everything they could think of. They filed an appeal of the judge's ruling, which was quickly denied. They sent letters threatening to sue me for tortious interference with their property rights, which Richard laughed at and filed away. They even tried to get the county to declare my road a public thoroughfare, which the county refused to do after reviewing the same documentation I'd shown the judge. Finally, Bradford Chen called Richard with a settlement offer. The HOA would pay me $100,000 for a permanent easement across my property. Richard called to tell me about it. It's actually not a bad offer, he said. More than your grandfather was offered back in the day. You could take the money, let them use the road, and everyone moves on. I thought about it for exactly 10 seconds. No, this isn't about money. This is about principle. They tried to bully me, they trespassed on my property, they caused damage, and they refused to acknowledge basic property rights until a judge forced them to. Why would I reward that behavior? Richard chuckled. I was hoping you'd say that. What do you want me to tell them? Tell them the road stays closed. If they want access, they can build their own road around my property or keep using the public routes. Their choice. The final outcome was exactly what I expected. The HOA held an emergency vote and approved $240,000 to construct their own access road connecting their development directly to the state highway. It took them 6 months to build, required environmental impact studies, and ended up being a political mess with angry residents blaming Karen for the whole situation. She was voted out as president 3 months after construction started, and according to Dutch, she ended up selling her house and moving away because she couldn't stand the constant criticism from her neighbors. As for me, my road is peaceful again. I had it properly graded and regraded with fresh gravel. I planted some wildflowers along the sides where the trash used to pile up. Sometimes I open the gate and just drive slowly down that mile of tree-lined gravel, thinking about my grandfather and his grandfather before him and how they built something meant to last. And it has lasted. Over 130 years of my family maintaining that road, protecting that property, and now it's my turn to be the steward. The gate stays closed except for invited guests and the occasional delivery. The security cameras haven't caught a single trespasser since the court ruling, And every time I look at that 1890 land patent hanging on my wall, signed by President Harrison and granting this land to my family, I'm reminded that some things are worth fighting for. Property rights matter, principles matter, and sometimes standing your ground against bullies, even when it would be easier to give in, is exactly what you need to do. Thanks for watching HOA Backdoor Stories. If you enjoyed today's drama, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share your thoughts below. I'll see you in the next episode, where another secret waits behind another door.